My name is Christy McLaughlin. I'm the Executive Director of the UIT Faculty Association, and probably more importantly, a former graduate student of Brian Palmer. So I will introduce David Thompson, who completed a PhD at Queen's on unemployment movements in Canada between the 1870s and 1920s, and he will be speaking on Dispossessed Agency, the revolutionary indignation of Canada's unemployed, 1870 to 1929.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really thankful for Brian for inviting me. I feel like I've been swimming in that warm stream of Marxism all weekend, and really loving it. Taking a telescopic view of the struggles of the Canadian workless prior to Black Tuesday challenges the picture of the Great Depression as the sudden, unexpected eruption of unemployment protests. Out of all proportion to their size and political strength, agitators amongst the dispossessed between 1870 and 1929 proved to be protagonists in forcing relief measures, thrusting socialist values into public discourse, and inspiring working class resistance. And at all times when the labor movement was at its weakest. Strategies of disruption and working class anguish and indignation were key resources for the organizers of the unemployed. The mobilized workless were, I believe, every bit as important to the vitality of the left as unions or political parties. I'd like to focus today on the role of the socialist organizer in engaging with and fostering the agency of the dispossessed in pre-Depression Canada. Given the sympathetic audience, I'm not going to delve into the Canadian particularities of the capitalist social formation and its liberal supplement. I'm not going to discuss the necessity of a surplus population to capital's valorization, the punctuated crises of the political economy, or the first inklings of what Todd McCallum has called the relief industry, although all of these issues require our attention. While aspects of my 2014 dissertation tilled this ground, the primary excavation was on unemployment protests in urban centres across Canada. In it, I contend that the protests of the workless in the fin de siècle ad hoc Les Miserables were motivated by notions of customary rights and New World obligations, a kind of redux of E.P. Thompson's 18th century moral economy. By the early 20th century, an organized mob was informed by some of Canada's earliest socialist organizers. Finally, an unemployed army emerged in the wake of the Great War and the coherence of the Communist Party of Canada. A casualty myself of the neoliberal academic climate, over the past year I found employment as an organizer for a national public sector union. In that role, I've been struck by how appeals to collective agency amongst unorganized workers hold parallels to the strategies of mobilizing the unemployed. As Michael Denning has suggested, and Brian Palmer and Gaetan Heroux echo in their soon-to-be-published book, and I'm quoting them here, the study of the dispossessed must begin with an understanding that working class life is not defined by either the wage or wagelessness, but is in actuality bounded by both. Labor historians need to be more sensitive to the ways the issues of job security factored into labor organizing and disputes, and determine their level of militancy. As a union organizer of public sector workers facing the threat of privatization and job loss, a key appeal to worker solidarity is predicated on the very possibility of their own dispossession. According to anti-poverty scholars Francis Fox Piven and Richard A. Cloward, quote, indignation, anger, resistance, and insurgency amongst the unemployed has played a crucial role in social welfare history and the viability of a leftist counterculture. How have radical organizers nurtured the indignant will of the unemployed, appealed to their first-hand knowledge of dispossession, and encouraged their revolutionary potential? Granted, the revolutionary is only one of many forms of dispossessed agency. Only a minority assumed such a radical position. Even Piven and Cloward admit, however hard their lot may be, people usually remain acquiescent. Worse, as Marx made clear in his controversial portrayal of the lumpen proletariat, the unemployed could prove reactionary. And the historical record is not without instances of the workless succumbing to mini Bonapartes or acting as strikebreakers. The unemployed most inclined to direct action tended to be those who believed they did not deserve to belong to the surplus population. It was the organizer's job to inspire all dispossessed to feel that way. Igniting the dignity and disruptive agency was the tested countermeasure to the reactionary or acquiescent. This was the plan to overcome what scholars have called the improbable mobilization of the unemployed. Tonight's performance by Bucky Halker will sum up this strategy in Joe Hill's simple provocation: don't mourn, organize. Pre-Depression organizers were most commonly skilled out-of-work tradespeople and or socialist politicians and intellectuals. Their ongoing ideological and action-based commitment to the unemployed, the working class, and an equitable social order was the basis of their organic leadership. Yet such leaders needed to reconcile two seemingly antagonistic strategies. The first antagonism concerned harmonizing the tactical need to escalate disruption with the risk it posed to the unemployed's bid for respectability. The second tightrope act was balancing their desire to inspire a revolution with achieving immediate goals. By taking a long view of Canada's unemployment movements, one can discern a general trend of mobilizers moving away from asserting respectability towards the all-out promotion of disruption. In the late 19th century, it makes sense that an artisanal labor leader like Alfred Jury supported moderation. Belief that the state would afford the unemployed ample relief if they proved their deservedness continued to have, and I'm quoting E.P. Thompson, a fragmentary real existence. Yet by the 1907-09 Depression, participation in protests had become a widely regarded indication that one was de facto undeserving. With more and more diaspora socialists participating in workless demonstrations, there was a growing sense that respectability was not even obtainable for the non-Anglo-Canadian. In the post-Great War era, Communist Party and One Big Union leaders refused the deserving-undeserving dichotomy. All were worthy of relief. But what of this revolution nonsense? When people are hungry, they want food. When unemployed, they demand work. A new world order is not their most pressing consideration. Even if desired reforms tended to secure capitalist relations, such small victories suggest to the disheartened the power of collective struggle. Without agitation, the single unemployed and immigrants would have had little access to relief in the pre-Depression era. Municipal relief and provincial and federal emergency aid was often initiated and extended thanks to agitation. City governments regularly spent thousands of dollars beyond their budgets to quell dissent. Even the electorally bent Socialist Party of Canada and the intransient communists created platforms that addressed bread and butter issues. Prior to the 20th century, agitators demanded work, not charity, the opening of public works, ending false advertising to immigrants, the shorter work week, the extension of the franchise, debt forgiveness, and the opening of public labor bureaus. By 1907, Socialist Party activists extended this list to include the banning of private labor bureaus, the construction of working-class homes, public lavatories, playgrounds, and pools, relief wages in accordance with fair wage legislation, public, not private charities, no discrimination in the allocation of relief work, the end of the work test, the right to free speech, housing for the single unemployed, and higher quality rations and accommodations for the destitute. In the pre-war economic downturn, many previous reform proposals were given new life. With free speech, the overturning of vagrancy laws, minimum wage laws, and the end of relief discrimination based on ethnicity, marital status, gender, and radical ideology, all receiving deeper attention. This depression also saw some of the first calls for unemployment insurance. Diaspora socialists presented their own distinct demands, such as funding for cultural activities, and especially in Montreal and Ottawa, state-funded or assisted transportation back to Europe if need be. With the arrival of the Communist Party, activists simplified and coordinated their reformist demands. By the summer of 1922, organizations across the country were united in calling for public works at full union rates, unemployment maintenance based on an average living wage, and wage top-ups for the underemployed. While productive work or full maintenance was the standard rallying cry, in practice, 1920s organizers focused on achieving the maximum amount of relief possible. The qualifier of productive was the means by which activists opposed breaking stone, chopping wood, and coercive work tests. Some organizers, especially in Winnipeg, began taking on casework and individual advocacy, appealing to authorities to supply provisions to individuals in dire need. Activists decried police brutality, imprisonment, and state surveillance practices. Communists attacked immigration officials while promising to defend the interests of all unemployed. After the war, based on the works of the likes of Edith Hancock's, the secretary of the First National Unemployment Association, movements more consistently demanded relief for single women. Organizers also pressed Ottawa to provide relief to veterans, although they refused to request preferential treatment for ex-soldiers. Other reform demands echo what Rosa Luxemburg called non-reformist reforms. Protesters engaged in two such reforms before 1929. From 1894 on, organizers have repeatedly demanded that unemployed associations be charged with the distribution of relief, a play on the workers' fight for control over the means of production. Although on a handful of occasions the authorities granted the workless representation on welfare boards, they never won full self-management. The other non-reformist reform was more strategic. Activists in the 20s developed a broad coalition of progressive social groups around the demand for federal, non-contributory unemployment insurance. As a welfare measure extracted directly from the profits of capital, this was a direct affront to the free market. Although based on a substantive rationality, such a pitch was also a pragmatic bartering chip. If Canadians favored non-contributory insurance, and by the height of the Great Depression, the Communist Party was able to muster over 100,000 signatures in its support, then, activists reasoned, the federal government would have no choice but to offer UI. In 1940, their strategy finally bore fruit. In engaging the unemployed, organizers developed a stunning array of repertoires. Some of these strategies, from organization, strategic demands, relief strikes, labor bureau sit-ins, and national petitions, were new developments designed to meet the exigencies of modern capitalism. Others, from mass dine and dashes to urban riots, put a new spin on the older repertoires of the moral economy. As Piven has suggested, and I quote, "Only slowly, through the experience of defeat and repression on the one hand, and the contingencies of imagination, invention, and the welling up of anger and defiance on the other, do new repertoires emerge that respond to new institutional conditions." European scholar Matt Perry has suggested three different levels of activities historically engaged in by the unemployed. The most militant include riots, occupations, and eviction protests, which pose a direct challenge to authorities and property. An intermediary repertoire includes the relief strike, demonstration, hunger march, and formalized petitions and delegations. Finally, public meetings, grievance representation, and cooperative activity comprise non-transgressive community-building repertoires. In the era of Les Miserables, the riot, or the expectation of riot, was more important than in generations that followed. The pilfering of beer, baker, and butcher sleighs during the 1875 Montreal demonstrations, the same city's riots in the 1890s, Toronto's anarchism-tinged occupations in the middle of that decade, all suggest the spontaneous and asphalous nature of fin de siècle protests. These riots relied less on socialist organization than on the harnessing of an older moral economy. Black flags played to inflated fears following the Haymarket riot. The protests in Ottawa in the late 1870s, however, under the leadership of the Working Men's Liberal Conservative Association, were primarily non-transgressive and were contingent upon appeals to the mutuality of interests between labor and capital and the paternalistic promise of the national policy. During the period of the organized mob, there was a noticeable growth in the intermediate and non-transgressive repertoires of action. That said, the dine and dashes at the Toronto House of Industry, at restaurants in Edmonton, and the rioting of the Austrian unemployed in Vancouver are indicative of how despair continued to provoke threats to property. The occupation of Edmonton churches in 1914 challenged religious authority and the hypocrisy of its complicity with capitalism. But the unemployed also explored a number of mutual aid initiatives. The efforts of socialist feminists in organizing cooperative societies in Toronto and Vancouver during the pre-war depression in order to reduce women's dependency on capitalists, the state, and a male provider stand out as an important development. A socialist labor bureau in Vancouver was also characteristic of this era's novel attempt to free the unemployed from state-capital collusion. It was at the intermediate level of action that the organized mob made significant headway, beginning with the Socialist Party Nanaimo relief workers' strike in 1908 to the IWW Edmonton Relief Camp strike in 1914. The unemployed withdrew their labor from the very relief work initiatives they had lobbied to implement. In doing so, they moved beyond the simplistic demand for work and insisted the state respect their dignity by providing meaningful labor, a decent quality of life, no discrimination, and some control over the means of production. But that was not all. The Socialist Party free speech fights in Toronto in 1908 and by socialists in the IWW in Vancouver 4 years later were all about the right of radicals to organize the unemployed who, unlike workers, had only the streets in which to gather and discuss their collective needs. Unlike during the Les Miserables period, delegations, petitions, and claim-making gave protests by the organized mob more coherence. Protests with crowds of 1,000 or more occurred in a half-dozen urban centers and were frequently repeated weekly for over a month or more during the pre-war depression. 15,000 unemployed marched in a 2-mile procession in Winnipeg in 1915 under the leadership of the Social Democratic Party of Canada. Predominantly composed of Austrians and other unemployed enemy aliens, they amounted to roughly 10% of the Winnipeg population. They possibly achieved the highest level of unemployment protest participation in any city in Canadian history. In the post-war era, all three repertoires of action were on display. Communist-led food-based riots occurred in 5 provincial capitals and Cape Breton. Occupations of city halls and employment services offices occurred in most major Canadian cities. And in Hamilton, the unemployed even threatened to occupy the armories. The hijacking of a train from Calgary to Edmonton was an unparalleled challenge to property rights. At the intermediate level, relief strikes on public work projects and at woodlots and stone yards occurred in at least 7 major Canadian cities. 3 well-orchestrated hunger marches involving veterans and British unemployed harvesters, amongst others, traveled to provincial and federal capitals. Free speech battles arose after unemployment gatherings were banned in Vancouver and in Halifax. Dozens of demonstrations accompanied by petitions and delegations to all levels of government occurred involving thousands of the unemployed. Yet we should not ignore the strides made in the 1920s in creating an unemployment community. For 2 winters, Vancouver's organizers drew crowds of 5,000 to Sunday parades. Unemployed Haligonians distributed their own charity and developed a survey to expose the prevailing opinions and potential enemies and allies of the unemployed. In Halifax and Toronto, the unemployed joined forces with labor and assisted striking miners and striking postal workers, respectively. On the cultural front in Toronto, the unemployed mustered together a short-lived Unemployment Review newspaper. Activists in Edmonton and Calgary held regularly Sunday mass meetings, which included music and skits that dramatized some of the degrading experiences the unemployed encountered in relief lines and at employment offices. Overall, socialist activists in the post-war years deserve credit for an unprecedented, even improbable effort to build an unemployment community and culture. If unemployment organization gave the workless hope, That was paradoxically because socialist leaders opened up spaces for the unemployed to articulate their indignation. That depressions have traditionally been dismissed as periods in which unions were prostate and ineffectual has blinded historians to the ways in which socialists have collectivized the weapons of the weak and demonstrated the potential of organized disruption. Socialists helped to build and sustain a culture of the dispossessed. Over time and with socialist guidance, the workless moved from an incoherent Les Miserables through impermanent collectives replete with elected leadership and platforms of reformist revolutionary demands to well-orchestrated organizations with considerable longevity and militancy. While this achievement was always vulnerable and contingent and far from complete by 1929, without it, the efficacy and power of workless activism during the Great Depression would have been inconceivable. Working class anguish and revolutionary indignation, rife in these 6 decades, were resources of hope, both for the unemployed and for the leftists who saw in their struggles the premonitions of a fairer world.